So hi, I'm here today
Hey.
with Neil Brown, president of the Poynter Institute and former editor of the then St. Pete Times.
So back in 2000, I was the managing editor of the paper, and I was in charge of the day-to-day operation, including all our election stuff, because I'm a total political wonk. And we always knew it was going to be a close election, and it was always going to be an interesting election because you got to keep in mind, and this is sort of important, the guy running for president, his brother was the governor of the state.
This was Bush or Gore for any
So
of
it
the
was George
students out there.
W. Bush
Okay.
running against Al Gore, Vice President Al Gore. We thought it'd be a close race, and it was. It was crazy close. And I remember how intense the readers were about it. We talk about how partisan and polarized it is today. Some of it started leading up to that, really with the Clintons in the 90s and then. So Florida was kind of like in play. It's where you really got the real first time I really ever heard the idea of swing state, and could it go either way, and could it tip the election? And you say that stuff in our political coverage all the time, but you never know if it really means anything. Let's be honest, right? So you don't know how it's going to go.
So tell me, as a journalist, your experience with election nights before that. We've talked to students about the fact that it's kind of romantic.
For all of you who've ever worked in a college newsroom, or even your high school newsroom, if you can do it, election night is like a special thing. So there's the cliches. You can make sure you order the pizza. That's like the first key planning. And we used to have revolts about where we're going to get pizza from, because after a while it would sort of default to Domino's, and then that was seen as like, come on, this is a bigger deal than Domino's, right? So then you got that issue, and you're providing drinks, and it's kind of an all-night deal. I mean, you kind of figure that at least you're going to start your day maybe a little later in the morning, and then go till the presses start running, which back then would be about 1:30 or 2 in the morning if you go that late. And again, you got to remember, sorry, old person here, there was no internet back then. So, I mean, election day was a really big deal where people might wake up in the morning, depending on when they went to bed, and not know till they got their paper who won. But it was it had that kind of lore. And there was also a sense that anytime you're working on election night, that next day's paper was one for the history books, that people save them, which they do to this day. And so that was part of the fun and the sort of responsibility, right? So you've got all this kind of intricacy planning, partly for the news value and partly for history. And it's always a lot of fun. And everybody'd be sort of assigned, you're going to be at this guy's headquarters, this woman's headquarters, photographers out.
So back in 2000, it was all hands on deck for this big event, and there was a little bit of tension.
Some polls had Gore up by a little, some had Bush up by a little going in. Now, nobody expected what happened.
So what did happen?
Everybody's talking about how this is going to be the weirdest election it'll be tough to top this, no matter how crazy this one looks like it's going to be. The networks, I can't remember whether it was AP and the networks, call it for Bush.
So in the back of your mind is this pressure that we've got to get this stuff ready to go so that it's ready to print. That's
the election. Florida was the deciding, right? And so we did a headline. I mean, all newspapers pretty much had to take the cues from the AP and the networks. Once it was called, we went with a headline that said Bush wins. They call Florida, AP calls Florida, the networks call that puts Bush over the top, and he's the next president of the United States. So it wasn't Bush wins Florida, it was Bush wins, right?
Because of Florida.
Because of Florida. Florida was the linchpin. So we go ahead, send the headline. It's like, all kind of tension, like, wow. Our political editor, a guy named Tim Nickens, had a source down in Fort Lauderdale, a guy named Bob Butterworth, former Attorney General of the state, and who was working for Gore, Democrat. And he was on the phone to Nickens because after the networks called it, and we were going with that headline, Gore called Bush and conceded. People forget that, but maybe some people don't. But he actually called George W. Bush and conceded the election. And Nickens was on the phone with Butterworth, and he was like, oh, he should not be conceding. This state is still too close to call. I can't believe it's been called yet. And so Nickens says, we don't really know what to do with that. But people are saying, don't do this. So Gore calls and concedes, further solidifying that it's Bush wins. The votes get tighter and tighter, and then the irregularities really start to flourish, where it appears through exit polls that a lot of people in Palm Beach County, a county very Democratic with a lot of older voters, and the way they had that very bizarre, what's later called the butterfly ballot, because the way it folded, the way the pages turned, that there's an unbelievable vote count for Pat Buchanan, who was extremely conservative.
Mm.
And a lot of votes in Palm Beach County, older people, were cast for Pat Buchanan, and it made no sense. So it got to the notion of, did they punch the wrong hole? Now, that's just the kind of irregularity people talked about. But it sort of said, like, what's going on? How come Gore's vote isn't even bigger in Palm Beach County? And if it was bigger, he had now caught up with Bush almost to the point of a tie. And if Florida's not in play, then Bush doesn't win necessarily. Anyways, scored and conceded. There was starting to be talk about irregularities. It was getting so close, the margin was shrinking over the evening for Bush, that the networks pulled back the call. The networks rescinded. Tom Brokaw went on and rescinded. We are no longer calling this election for President Bush. And Al Gore called Bush back and took back his concession. Right? So instead, the networks have called it for Bush. Gore has conceded, and now the networks are uncalling it for Bush. And Gore is calling Bush himself and saying, I take it back. I'm not giving up this election. Bush is still in the lead, actually, but it was not substantial enough, and it was so close. So keep in mind, I just told you,
Meanwhile,
the presses are running. So this is the only time in my life, but it was a blast in a tense, anxious way. I call the plant. I go, hey, it's Neil. I need you to stop the presses. And they did. So it must have been closer to the 2 or 2:30 range, because at that point they hadn't wasted too many papers. They'd wasted some. We tossed the papers.
you didn't save one?
I can't find it. I got to find one.
Maybe not.
We went with a new headline, photo finish. So we stayed up all night and we did an extra. We stayed there till 5, and we ran the presses again at 5:30 with a big poster front recount, because they were going to have to recount Florida. And then keep in mind, it went on, then that recount began, and 31 days later, we picked the president. Not 5 or 7, 31 days later. And of course, Jeb Bush, the governor of the state, has a major say in what the electors do. And he didn't recuse himself, but his brother was on the ballot, and he was saying these votes count. His Secretary of State, now she was an elected official, but the Secretary of State, Catherine Harris, there was just we had to constantly report out tons of vitriol and rumors that she was just doing Jeb's bidding, and she herself was a very ineffective public servant. And she later got spoofed and said, you would start to feel bad, because she was looked into like she was way over her head, because everybody was in over their heads, because nobody had seen anything like this in their lives. And then there were court fights and all of that. And then, of course, if you want to tie it to today's situation, we worry about this notion of, will things get tense or even violent or, aggressive in the recounting. Down in Miami, I forget exactly what point, probably a week, 4 or 5 days into it, when they were recounting ballots, Roger Stone, the President Trump's ally, was working for Bush, and he organized what was later called the Brooks Brothers riots, because there were all these lawyers in suits who pressed and literally forced their way in to try to stop recounting violently. I mean, they didn't shoot anybody, but they were, and that's the kind of tension. I believe to some degree, not just because it was ultimately decided by a Supreme Court decision, but that level of tension was the real kind of birth of the polarization we have today. It was so intense as well. And in the end, organizations like the St. Pete Times, we put together a coalition. The Miami Herald did their own. Tried to do as much of the vote counting as we did. Try to do our own recounting.
So you guys actually went in and did recounts as well.
Tried. Because they're public records, you could try to get the vote tallies, and you had to get the records from different. Some counties wouldn't cooperate, some didn't. And, you know, the irony is, I think, although he did not win the national popular vote, you know, officially the count is that Bush did win Florida by 537 votes. And our reporting on that didn't change that result. I would say this, it did show this. And this is why close elections are tough in right, the most, the richest and most accomplished country in the world. If it's super close, we don't know what to do about it. There's nothing you can do. So for instance, we certainly came to the conclusion, talking to people, looking at votes, that there were undoubtedly well more than 530 people who misvoted. And the design of the ballot was so flawed, and frankly, it was not designed to suppress, but suppressed voting or affected voting. And the courts have no remedy for an election going bad unless there's just outright corruption. So what we do know is that Bush won Florida by 537 votes. What we also really have, there's plenty of documentation to believe, more people in Florida voted for Gore that day or thought they did. Get ready, but get out on the streets, talk to people, make sources, and don't fall victim to every social media thing that's out there, or TV thing. It's not just a social media problem. The hardest part is going to do original reporting. Well, we need to be signing up people left and right to be eyes and ears.
Yeah, what are the takeaways? What do student journalists need to do on November 3rd?
Well, it's like everything. First of all, you know, try to make your sources ahead of time. Go to your county supervisor or people who work in the office. Establish yourself by phone, in person, so that you can see and lay eyes on who are the people you're getting your information from. 2, they will be busy and swamped that day, but find people who you trust. That's really key. Source making is still our biggest strength and our soft underbelly when we don't do it, when we just take second and third hand information and think that that's multiple sources. That's my number one thing. And I know it's going to be tougher with COVID and all, but try to do it. You know, mask up and get out on the street yourself. Go talk to voters if you can, sort of see what's going on. You're just trying to pick up a vibe. It's not like you're going to go out there and vote count. Again, in advance, find out what the rules are. So particularly with this mail-in question, find out how they will be counted. Are they counting, do they start the day of? Were they already counted in advance? Are postmarks allowed? How are they deciding whether signatures match or don't match? Try to understand the process. Now is not the time to be afraid of being a wonk, right? You know, go ahead and learn the rules so that you know the rules, check what you know, and then you can speak to the rules. Don't just rely on others to tell you what they are. Similarly, believe it or not, and then I would make good sources in each of the parties, because they will have a perspective and you don't want to be shut out of what they're talking about or saying. Relationships are everything in covering something like this.
Okay.
And oh, by the way, write the stuff you know, write that now, because that way you don't want to be doing that on deadline.